Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thanks for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi. During the past 10 seasons in the NCAA, dating back to about 2010, we've seen such a diverse group of stunning results in FBS play. And that includes anything from a major point spread that missed the mark, or a top 25 team that fell from grace, or an FCS team that pulled out a stunning win, or a combination of any of the above. Upsets rocked college football in the past 10 years. And a majority of the time, the favorite team wins in college football. We know that. It's why upsets are so significant, and it's why they stand out so much more. Unless, of course, it's your favorite team on the losing side. So in this episode, in the spirit of upset games and why we love them, we're going to cover the top 10 best upsets of the past decade. And starting with numbers 10 and 9, number 10 dates back to 2017, and it's personally one of my favorite games. And thinking back to watching it live, it's definitely one of the most exhilarating feelings I've ever gotten watching a college football game. And I'm not even a personal fan of either team involved, so that should speak volumes in its own. And the matchup I'm talking about is Howard versus UNLV. And while the matchup itself obviously didn't have any major national implications back in 2017, that's not really a shock. But nevertheless, Howard's victory was the most shocking upset in at least college football betting history, period. UNLV came in as a 45-point favorite, but they also committed 3 turnovers. They missed 2 field goals, and that really crushed them. The Bison came out and led the entire first half, but they did slide a little bit and allow UNLV to come back in the third quarter and catch up and recover from a 21-9 deficit. And then Howard fell behind 33-21. Then they fought back. They scored 3 touchdowns within the last 17 minutes of the game. And they were down 4 points with 7 minutes remaining. And that's when Kalen Newton earned his claim to fame, really, and ran the ball into the end zone to give the Bison a 43-4 lead and finally change for the game and win, ultimately, for the ages. And watching that live, I just couldn't believe what I was watching. I remember thinking that. And I know a lot of people who also saw that game and even just saw highlights from the game afterwards were also stunned by, again, a game that didn't really have any implication towards a bowl game or include any college football playoff contenders. But UNLV was so favored in that matchup that year that Vegas didn't even bother to make a point spread for it, which is unbelievably disrespectful, in my opinion, to Howard. And I remember thinking that at the time, too. And that's probably in the back of their minds what motivated them a little bit. You would think that any competitive athlete would be upset by that fact. So even though Vegas didn't bother to even make a point spread, in other places, Howard was listed as a 45-point underdog, and they had just over a 1% chance to win the game going in. And they are part of a program where you see a lot of FCS schools playing, the bigger name schools or even just FBS schools in general. And they call them guarantee games. So this was one of the guarantee games for Howard, and they did end up receiving $600,000 to play this game. So ultimately, you could kind of say that they really had nothing to lose in this situation. Being a smaller school on the football stage that receives money from a bigger school like University of Nevada, Las Vegas, to travel to them and basically guarantee, quote-unquote guarantee, a win for the home team. Obviously, Howard had other plans in mind this time around, and they spoiled that expected beatdown they were there to, quote-unquote, get. And a lot of that had to do with Kalen Newton, who I mentioned earlier, and he put up 330 total offensive yards and 3 touchdowns himself. And if the name kind of sounds familiar, that's because he's none other than Cam Newton's younger brother. And that definitely gave the Bison a little bit of a leg up to help them to an all-time upset victory. And actually, it was their head coach, Mike London's debut game. So you can't really get any better than that when you're talking upsets. And that's why, at least for me personally, it comes out on definitely one of my favorite upset games of this past decade. And it definitely had to make the cut into this list. But that brings us to number 9 on the list. And that's 2015's Georgia Tech versus Florida State game. And Florida State has been a prominent program for quite some time. Even in 2013, not too long before, they won a national title. And they reached the CFP as an undefeated 13-0 team the following year in 2014. And they started out in 2015 as a 6-0 undefeated team, and they were on a 25-game regular season win streak over other ACC teams. Georgia Tech, on the other side, meanwhile, opened the year 2-0, so they had a great start as well, but they dropped 5 straight coming into their matchup with Florida State. So 2 very contrasting seasons at the point where they met. And Georgia Tech played very good defense. They were nothing to sneeze at for sure, but you could tell that they didn't have as much confidence in this one. For good reason, obviously, given the context. And they needed a last-minute field goal just to even the score at 16. And, you know, Florida State immediately drove the ball right back down the field and set up the potential game winner for Roberto Aguayo, who was the nation's best kicker at the time. This looked like a piece of cake. And this is another game that I remember watching live. And as college football fans might know by now, if you already know how this game went down, instead of the dramatic win that we expected to go in FSU's favor, they instead suffered such a painful loss. It's still unbelievable to believe what we actually watched during that game. The ball was tipped and deflected about 20 yards past the line of scrimmage, and then it was scooped up and gone in the opposite direction for Georgia Tech before you even realized what was going on. And he followed his blockers who were on point in front of him all the way to the end zone, 78 yards for a touchdown and a 22-16 win. And that really was the beginning of the downfall of FSU's title or claim to being the powerhouse of the ACC, you know, and that's when it really became Clemson's division to lose, and they emerged from there, and it really hasn't been the same for Florida State since then. And, you know, that, not to say that upset loss is the reason why they're still struggling today, because there are a lot of other factors that go into it, but such a demoralizing loss after 2 straight years of playing on a high kind of knocked the wind out of the sails for Florida State. So let's see if whenever college football is able to resume, we'll get the Florida State of old. That brings us to our first break, but when we come back, we're going to hit numbers 8 and 7 on the countdown list.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. In the first segment, we touched on numbers 10 and 9 of the best upset games of the past decade countdown lists, covering Howard UNLV from 2017 and 2015's Georgia Tech Florida State game. Now we're moving on to numbers 8 and 7, and starting with number 8, this one dates back to 2015 when the Citadel took on South Carolina. And this was an interesting game for both sides because South Carolina especially was just 2 seasons removed from going 3 straight 11-win seasons in a row. And their head coach, Steve Spurrier, at the time just kind of called it quits during this 2015 season here. And they were off to a horrible start, granted, but it's not like they were irredeemably bad where they couldn't salvage something of the season. It wasn't what they were used to, but at 2-4, you wouldn't expect that your head coach is just going to up and quit and ultimately retire, but it got worse from there for them, and they ended up dropping 5 straight games to end that season. And that includes this game right here against the Citadel, which is an FCS program. Most of these upset teams do, or upset games do include FCS teams. But this is one program that had lost 28 games in a row to FBS opponents. This is like the rollover team. The Citadel is usually a school that's known for scheduling against powerhouses like, at the time, South Carolina or Alabama. You see them face a lot. Clemson, other schools that are in the South. And this time they had a date with South Carolina scheduled for November of 2015. And of course they were a mess at the time, but it really doesn't look like they had an excuse to give up 350 yards on the ground to this offense that only tried to throw 3 passes all game. Like, that's still, thinking about that still really blows my mind. And South Carolina's Pharaoh Cooper, who's now in the NFL at the time, seemed to catch what would have been the go-ahead touchdown in the final minute, but a false start penalty. You can call it bad luck, bad officiating, whatever you want to call it. There was a false start penalty that negated that score, and they went down 23-22 to the Citadel abysmally. Even though they went into that game a 22-point favorite over the Bulldogs, the Citadel was able to take advantage of a heavily deflated Gamecocks team, and they ran all over them, like literally and figuratively. And it really wasn't a great look for South Carolina. They finished 3-9 that year, the worst year since they went without any wins back in 1999. And for a school like the Citadel, which is basically signed up to let the SEC run all over them for their guaranteed games, this win is a pretty big deal. And South Carolina definitely didn't take it lightly. And luckily for them, they've become a better team since then, and the Citadel doesn't pull off nearly as many upsets, especially since they play Alabama every year. But this one still holds a special place in the biggest upsets of this decade. And that brings us to number 7 on the list. Old Dominion took on Virginia Tech back in 2018, and ranked at number 13 that year. Virginia Tech came in 2018 ranked in the top 25, which is not that common for a Virginia Tech team. And they kicked off the season with a win over another ranked team, Florida State, that year, before they claimed one of their guaranteed wins over William and Mary. So coming into this third game of the season, they were making their first trip to a Conference USA team in Old Dominion, and they went in as almost a 30-point favorite. On the other side, Old Dominion hadn't won a game that season yet, and they were at the mercy of a backup quarterback who was named Blake LaRussa. But none of that really got in their heads, obviously. They were able to show that they had every intention in coming out on the field and giving Virginia Tech their all. But at first, it looked like same old, same old. Virginia Tech came out and took an immediate touchdown lead over Old Dominion with an 87-yard touchdown run. And then they started trading touchdowns for 3 quarters. But Virginia Tech still never fell behind until they reached the fourth quarter. The Hokies went in with a touchdown advantage, but the fourth quarter was unfortunately and obviously not in Virginia Tech's favor, but the way it just unraveled very quickly is still kind of bewildering, to be honest. Their quarterback, Josh Jackson, broke his left leg, his fibula, and that injury actually ended his quarterback career at Virginia Tech, and that just kind of opened the door and the floodgates for ODU, and their offense scored 4 times in the last 15 minutes, turning that one-score deficit 28-21 game into a 49-35 win, astonishingly. And their quarterback, LaRussa, threw for almost 500 yards and 4 touchdowns himself, which is crazy to think it's coming out of a backup. But not only did they manage to steal an impressive win and an upset, it was also their school's first win over a Power 5 opponent in their history. So it was obviously a pretty big deal, and for good reason. This game had all of the typical factors and signs that nothing special is going to happen here. It's business as usual. You know, no reason to believe that this underdog team from a school that you've probably never heard of, like Old Dominion, honestly, how many people have heard of that or even know where that is there's no way that they're gonna come out and even have a chance against this much bigger school. Granted, Virginia Tech isn't a superpower by any means, especially not in football nowadays, but they still had some sway and some power over Old Dominion at the time, and they absolutely squandered it for what looks like no apparent reason. So that's the beauty of college football, and that's why this is made halfway up the list, or just about halfway up the list, because it's games like that keep us on our toes and keep us paying attention to what's going to happen next, or who's going to come out of the woodworks and be the Cinderella team for this one Saturday in this fall of whatever season. And really, when it played out on that fall weekend in 2018, it just demonstrated and painted out the epitome of what a great college football upset is. And at the time, we probably didn't know that's what we were watching or about to watch, but it honestly turned into one that'll be an instant classic looking back on it. That brings us to our next break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about numbers 6 and 5 on the countdown list.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. In the first two segments, we touched on the first four upset games from this past decade that topped the list, at least in my opinion. And that brings us to numbers 6 and 5 on this list. And we're going to start with number 6, which goes back 7 years to 2013 when Georgia Southern took on Florida. And that Florida team, even, you could say the same thing about recent Florida teams, but we know that they weren't the greatest. You could say that they sucked. Yes, they sucked. They didn't win many games. They looked really bad. They were not ranked for a long time. You can say a lot of things that point to how bad Florida was at that time. And they had so many injuries, especially for this specific November game in 2013. But at the same time, you're not expecting Florida, especially at the beginning of this past decade, to lose to an FCS team. Because, for one, Florida has never lost to an FCS team up to that date. And if you don't already know, you can kind of tell already where this is going. But it wasn't even just the fact that they lost to an FCS team. In this specific game, it made it even more disastrous for them that they lost to an FCS program that didn't even complete a pass. And that just looked horrendous for Florida. And Georgia Southern was mediocre at best that year, 6 and 4. They were playing their last game as an FCS school, so really the Florida Gators had no reason to mess this up. They had one job if they wanted to keep this one obscure streak intact and going. But for some reason, they kept the Eagles from completing a pass, but allowed them to make up for it by rushing for over 400 yards on the ground. And granted, they were up against who turned into a future NFL back and Jerick McKinnon, who ended up scoring the game-winning touchdown even late in the fourth quarter with about 3 minutes and change left on the clock. But at the same time, they came in as an underdog and walked out of the swamp with a 26-20 victory. And no matter how you spell that out or how it went down, that just spells failure in Florida's book, honestly. And that's just, even from the outside looking in, knowing the kind of program that Florida has been and the heights that they've reached, it really is an embarrassment for them. And that is what makes this upset even more poignant and even more painful, especially for the fan base, is the fact that it's not something that you ever thought you would see, even within the category of an upset. They really just went out there and looked like they weren't out on the field at all. Georgia Southern even missed the extra point, and it didn't matter because they were able to stop Florida on downs and secure the win. They were able to shut down the Gators in the swamp on their own field. And to add insult to injury, they handed the Gators their first losing season since 1979. They finished that year 4-8. So the loss itself was pretty bad, but if you add in the context around it and all the stuff they were going through at the time and have been going through since, this really isn't the best look for Florida at all. And it's without a doubt, especially if you ask Florida fans, classified as one of the worst, if not the worst, losses in their history. They had no answers for Georgia Southern's offense at all. And not only that, they went on the next week to lose to their rival Florida State. So if you want to think about a losing skid that you wouldn't want to see your team on, this is definitely the one to end all losing skids. And unfortunately for them, it didn't even stop at the next week, and they ended that season with 7 straight losses. So let's just say that 2013 is a year that Florida fans probably really want to forget and would really hate to hear brought up all over again. But for anybody else on the outside, it's a great example of one of the most unbelievable, at least in my opinion, upsets of this past decade. And it's definitely going to be a talking point for a long time going forward. So Florida fans, you might want to strap in and if you haven't already, just brace yourself to keep hearing about that game for the rest of your life. Moving on to number 5 on the list. That brings us to 2015's Michigan versus Michigan State game. And just like the last game with Georgia Southern in Florida, this game was definitely shocking in a way you didn't see coming, but for a different reason. It's not just because it's, a pathetic loss, no offense, Florida fans, on one side of the ball for one fan base, but it's because this game in 2015 had one of the greatest endings in any game in college football history. And in the years since then, it hasn't been forgotten. And it's just been described in so many ways by people. But honestly, the one word that probably sums it up the best is miraculous. Because Michigan was literally 10 seconds away from beating Michigan State and handing them their first loss of the season that year. And they were going to come out on top. They were going to beat their arch rival and have all the things that go with that, of course. All they had to do, they had one job, and that was to punt the ball away. That's it. Just punt the ball away. And instead, what unfolded before our eyes, what a lot of Michigan fans probably still can't believe, is to date one of the wildest finishes that I've personally ever seen. It's literally top 5 on the top of my head, and not just one of the wildest finishes in their series, but in all the sports. And it birthed one of the greatest unforgettable sports phrases, which is, "He has trouble with the snap." You can still hear it playing back in your head. At least I can. I don't know about anybody else, but that's when you remember when punter Blake O'Neal just lost control of the ball and watched it bounce off his hands, seemingly in slow motion, because of course all these moments always look like they're taking place in slow motion, even while you're living it. And it was just a high snap, and it was mishandled. Happens. You see it happen all the time, especially in crucial moments, but you never expect it to happen in a crucial moment like this. And to his credit, he picked up the ball and tried to kick it again, but he was being swarmed by Michigan State players. So instead, of course, it popped out, and that went from bad to worse, and things were just bleak for the Wolverines. When the ball was scooped up by Spartans defensive back Jalen Watts-Jackson, and he ran it back to score the go-ahead touchdown with the clock running down. You look up at the scoreboard, the score reads Michigan State 27, Michigan 23, clock is triple zeros. And then all of a sudden, mayhem is breaking out on the field. Michigan State players that were ready to go back into the locker room and cry over this loss probably, all of a sudden are elated, and then vice versa for Michigan players who were thinking they were walking off with victory. And Michigan fans in the stands were just stunned. There was silence in the stands. The fan reactions that came out of Michigan Stadium to this day are still gifs and are still memes. It immediately went viral, that reaction. A fan, unfortunately, literally had a heart attack. That's how serious this gets sometimes. And there was a bittersweet ending to this on top of all of that. The hero on this play for Michigan State, Watts-Jackson, on the winning score, actually broke and dislocated his hip on the tackle in the end zone. And it didn't make it better that his teammates piled on top of him in celebration, unknowingly, obviously. But he did have to have surgery, and that did actually bring his season to an end. But he said that he had no regrets and said he'd do it all again for his brothers. But obviously, that is such an unlikely ending that Spartans fans never saw coming, Wolverines fans never saw coming. And the Spartans had even already given the rivalry trophy, the Paul Bunyan trophy, to Michigan. Like, they had already conceded defeat. So, the cliche that it's not over till it's over definitely showed its face in this one. And obviously they went and got that trophy right back real quick. And that game really had such positive implications for MSU for that season. It went on and lifted them to 7-0, and they ended up playing for and winning the Big Ten title and making it into the CFP for that season. But of course, that didn't really last, and the next year they collapsed to 3-9, of course, and are still trying to make their way back to at least the same level they were at before. But at least for this game, that one game in 2015 against their arch rival, which there's no better time to pull out your best stuff. They were sitting at probably the highest high that Michigan State and their fans have had in this entire decade. And that brings us to our next break. But when we come back, numbers 4 and 3 are going to be on deck. You won't want to miss it.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. Now, before the break, in the first 3 segments, we covered numbers 10 through 5, the first half of the countdown, into the top 10 best upset games of the past decade. Now, we're going to jump back in this segment with number 4, and that spot belongs to 2017's game between Troy and LSU. And this is a really interesting one and probably an underrated one, but I really like it, especially given the context of LSU, not just now, but even at the time. They really were an up-and-coming team. They obviously didn't have any claims to being the best team in college football history yet, but they hadn't lost a non-conference game at home up to that point since the year 2000. And they had 49 straight wins over that span, but this underdog team that most people don't even pay attention to, wouldn't even know where they are. Troy, they just came in and ended that streak, and they actually believed they could come in there and topple LSU in Death Valley, which is a daunting task, to say the least. And they came in as 21-point underdogs. That's fair. But they certainly didn't come out playing like underdogs. On the first offensive snap that LSU had, Troy came out and forced a fumble and quickly scored a touchdown and had a 10-0 lead heading into halftime, which I'm sure LSU didn't see coming. But Troy obviously played like they did. And by the time the third quarter hit, they'd extended that advantage to 17 points. So LSU, which was ranked at the time, they were 25th, but they were still ranked. They needed something, and they were desperate, obviously. So they managed to wrangle up 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter really quickly. But they kind of sealed their own fate when the Tigers quarterback at the time, Danny Etling, threw an interception in the final seconds of the game. And that is the least clutch result you'd want to see out of your quarterback. So that's obviously heartbreaking for Tigers fans. But even players themselves had to admit that it really was a gritty fight to the end. And the best team on that day wins. And honestly, that's what it comes down to a lot of the time. And even feature NFL linebacker at the time, Devin White said that you can tell that Troy wanted it more. They came out and they both played their best, and one team is clearly better on paper than the other, but at the end of the day, it comes down to who wanted it more, and even the players themselves had to acknowledge that Troy came out and wanted it more, and that's really what leads to upsets a lot of the time, underestimating your opponent. And it looks like that's what LSU did a little bit of that day, and it really came back to bite them, and they paid for it. And it looks like they paid for it more than once, literally, because remember the guarantee games that has been mentioned a couple times? Well, this falls into that category, and LSU actually had to pay Troy for beating them, and it wasn't cheap either. It was $985,000. That's how much the loss on their own homecoming weekend cost them. So, upsets don't come cheap, apparently. And that's a great lesson that LSU definitely learned very quickly, because they haven't made the same mistakes since. And let's hopefully, knock on wood, not see them make the same mistake anytime soon. Moving up to number 3 on the list, that brings us to the matchup between UCF and Louisville in 2013. And in 2013, Louisville was really at their peak. They had tied their best school record in school history with the 12-1 season. And their head coach, Charlie Strong, was heading into his last season leading the Cardinals. Not to mention, they were being led by a Heisman candidate at the time, Teddy Bridgewater. And they were ranked number 8th in the country and 14-point favorites over UCF at the time. Not to mention they were playing at home, so they had everything going for them. You know how the story goes. That's how the best upsets are painted. UCF wasn't a slouch of a team by any means, but they did have one loss also, and they were being led by Blake Bortles at the time, who people now might recognize from playing for the Jacksonville Jaguars in the NFL for a few years. But things were essentially going as you would expect them to at first. The Cardinals were running the game to start, and they led up by as much as 28-7 going into the third. That was until UCF scored twice and ran the ball in for another touchdown and ended up tying the game at 28. Louisville regained a short lead with 3 minutes left, but obviously that wasn't enough. And opposing quarterback Blake Bortles, which if you pay attention to the NFL today, still sounds very weird to hear this upcoming sentence, but Bortles completed a touchdown pass to give UCF the last-minute upset win, and that also helped the Knights earn a berth into the BCS bowl contention of that year. So that was a pretty big deal for UCF, and it really kicked off a fire next few years for them. But it was a little bit of a disappointment for Louisville when you factor in the fact that they had a stretch of so many great years beforehand. In the 2 years prior, they had won the Big East titles back-to-back. So they were coming in strong, led again by Teddy Bridgewater with a very solid team behind them. And they were about to jump over to the ACC and try to set up their program for major success going forward after trying to appear in a BCS bowl game that year. So this game really sticks out when you put all that context behind it, because this really came as the turning point for both teams. What was supposed to be kind of set up for Louisville to become, and like all of the attention and the trajectory that they had up to that point, kind of ended up shifting to UCF almost immediately after this. Even that season alone, they went on to win 7 more games behind Blake Bortles again, mind you. And even though he wasn't a scrub in college, but that still sounds weird to say today in hindsight. And they even capped off that season with a Fiesta Bowl win over Baylor. They did stumble a little bit in 2015 when they went through a struggle of a winless season, but those recruiting classes from that 2013 game and that 2014 following seasons kind of laid the foundation for the 2017 season that we saw a few years ago, where they really had their resurgence and popped up on national radars, essentially for the first time in a long time, with their undefeated 13-0 season under Scott Frost. So this game really had a thread that extended way beyond even just this year, and it had implications for both teams, and it really kind of solidified legacies. So this game was more than just an upset that lasted that day, but it really is an upset that shaped the direction of two different programs. And you could suggest for Louisville that it did more than just upset their game or their season, but it really upset their program, because after, having quarterbacks on such a level as Teddy Bridgewater or Lamar Jackson, they really haven't returned to the same level of prominence that they had back in 2013, and UCF has a lot to do with stealing their thunder. So Cardinal fans, if you're still holding on to some anger from this event and you have some grief you'd like to point in a direction, go find your nearest UCF Knights fan and let them know how you feel. That brings us to our next break, but when we come back, we're going to unveil the top 2 choices on my top 10 upsets of the last decade countdown list. And you won't want to miss which ones come out on top.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. In the first 4 segments, we covered the top 8 upset games of the past decades that stood out to me the most. So now that we've reached the final segment, we're going to cover the top 2 games, upset games of the last decade. And coming in at number 2 for me is Iowa State taking on Oklahoma State back in 2011. And this one was especially fun because it had a lot of factors involved. First of all, it went to double overtime. I believe it's the only one on this list that went to double overtime. And Oklahoma State was coming in undefeated, and they definitely had their eyes on the BCS National Championship game for that year. They thought they were facing an easy road through Iowa State, and they were going to follow that up with matchups against number 13 Oklahoma and number 4 Stanford at the time. But before heading into this matchup, seemingly easy matchup with Iowa State, there was a plane crash that killed Oklahoma State's women's basketball coach, Kurt Budke, and his assistant, Miranda Serna. So obviously their football program and their entire Cowboys community was in a state of mourning, and they were clearly very shaken by the plane crash that hit close to home. So they're fresh off of that, and the game before, they toppled Texas Tech by 60 points. So they have that on their mind, they have the crash on their mind, and now they're traveling to Iowa to play Iowa State in November of 2011 with an undefeated 10-0 record. So led by Mike Gundy that year, they really only needed to wins left to secure their national title chances. As most upsets usually go, things looked fine for them. They were ahead for most of the game. They had a 24-7 lead heading into the second half. But that's when the momentum really started to shift. And Oklahoma State's offense really just stalled out massively and just kind of shut down on them. They fumbled. They went 3 and out. They were led by quarterback Brandon Weeden at the time, which, if you know how his NFL career went, it's no surprise that he threw an interception at that point. They punted back-to-back, and even late in the fourth quarter, their kicker missed the potential go-ahead 37-yard field goal, which isn't even that far of a field goal, even in college. So it really just came down to Oklahoma State letting this one get away from them. And you can point to any reason or excuse or explanation that you want, but at the end of the day, they gave the Cyclones the opening they needed, and they managed to come back and tie the game at 24, send it to double overtime, and that's where their running back, Jeff Woody, was able to score a 4-yard touchdown run and seal the game for Iowa State, which led to their crowd storming the field. And when you're a visiting team coming in expecting to win, that's probably the worst feeling you can have, and the last thing that you want to see, especially since they basically just trampled all over Oklahoma State's championship dreams with this upset loss. And that loss really did cost the Cowboys a spot in that BCS title game that year, even though they only had one loss during the regular season. You know, and it really didn't mean anything for Iowa State because they lost their next 3 and had a losing record on the season, so they were really just there to play spoiler, adding insult to injury definitely for Oklahoma State. And that's what makes it one of, if not the most heartbreaking upsets in college football history. But it only comes in at number 2 on my list, and that's because number 1, the top spot, has to go to James Madison and Virginia Tech all the way back at the beginning of the decade in 2010. And this game between JMU and Virginia Tech was just flat out ridiculous that year. Ultimately, it ended up being a positive season for Virginia Tech that year. They went on to have a perfect conference record, appear in the Orange Bowl, 11 wins, ACC champions, but they did have their struggles to start out the season. That included a season opener loss to Boise State and this game right here against FCS program James Madison. And not only is this already a program you wouldn't expect Virginia Tech to struggle against, since they came into this 2010 season ranked 10th in the country, but even in this game, you probably would have expected them to win if you looked at the stats on paper, because JMU only put up just over 200 yards of offense. But where they killed them was that they still put 3 touchdowns on the board and generated 3 takeaways. And those intangibles, especially the takeaways that change the flows of the game, take away scoring chances, give lopsided time to one side of the ball. Those are all things that helped turn this game surprisingly in James Madison's favor. And even Virginia Tech players themselves couldn't believe it after the loss. And they really couldn't tell what had happened. And watching it, you really couldn't explain what happened when you saw James Madison overtake Virginia Tech. And this is not even the first time Virginia Tech has made the list in this countdown alone. But whereas that upset was an ugly one, yes, but it was also in a wasted season. They only finished 6-7. They weren't really going anywhere. They weren't ranked, anything like that. this one hurt a lot more because they had a lot on the line, especially since they were going into this game against James Madison hoping to rebound from their loss to Boise State. But to their credit, JMU managed to keep the game really close. And even though their previous two meetings, they were outscored by a combined score of 98-0, they didn't let that affect them coming in. And instead, they were the surprise for Virginia Tech. Their starting quarterback, Drew Dudzik, was part of all of their touchdowns. He threw a 73-yard bomb himself. He ran in two on the ground, and all of that came down to the last 5 minutes of the game with Virginia Tech holding the ball and hoping to avoid the upset. We all know how this goes, especially if you remember the game from then. The ball was fumbled by Darren Evans, still unbelievable to this day, and it gave the game away pretty much. And James Madison, all they had to do from there was run down the clock and ran out the game, and that sealed a 21-16 win. And this FCS school unbelievably beat Virginia Tech at home just by dominating the second half and playing amazing defense, lockdown defense obviously, against an elite program with an elite running game. So it obviously should be looked at as the biggest win in their history, and players on that team called it the biggest win in their school's history. But luckily for Virginia Tech, unlike other games on this list, that loss didn't necessarily destroy their season. It was obviously an upset, especially even more coming off of the back of losing to the third best team in the country and trying to right the horse. But they did manage to pull together 11 wins in a row and end the season ranked number 15, while bouncing back to win the ACC's championship and, a berth in the Orange Bowl, which was mentioned before. But you may or may not consider that a success since they were beaten down by Stanford in that game. But the entire season wasn't a wash, at least like it was in their 2018 upset. And they were just able to give us an upset game for the ages for sure. That brings us to our final break. But when we come back, we're going to dive a little bit deeper on this topic and suss out the 5 biggest upset plays in college football history. Don't go anywhere.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. In this episode, we covered the top 10 biggest upset games in the last decade in college football. And we took everything from Howard versus UNLV at number 10 to James Madison versus Virginia Tech at number 1. And searching through all of those games, they all definitely have one thing in common, and that's a turning point, and usually a turning point play. And there are a lot of plays in college football history that stand out, even within this century alone. And they all contributed to the upset result of a game or an upset on the play itself. So in this final segment, we're going to take a little bit of a closer look and see what the 5 biggest upset plays are from college football games. And we're going to start off with Ohio State and Michigan meeting up in 2016. And this is definitely a play that sticks out, especially with the recent replaying of the game on TV And just to recap a little bit of what went into this play, the Buckeyes, Ohio State, were trailing by 3 in the bottom half of the double overtime. So, this game already has a few of my favorite aspects. It has not just one overtime, but 2 overtimes. It has a rivalry involved. It has a close score involved with, I would say, limited time, but in double overtime, there's not even a clock. So sudden death is still implied. And to top it all off, it's on a 4th down. It's a 4th and 1 from Michigan 16. And Ohio State's coach Urban Meyer chose to do a quarterback sneak over going with the kicker. And whether the quarterback at the time, J.T. Barrett, was able to get the tip of the football over the painted stripe is impossible to tell. It's impossible to know unless you're on one side of the rivalry or the other. Then your answer is probably pretty distinct. But for the rest of us objective, unbiased fans, you can say what you want, but the line judge declared that it did cross the line. The referee agreed with it, and the video review couldn't overturn it. So the winning touchdown was scored on the next snap. And, of course, officiating was complained about, especially by Michigan head coach Jim Harbaugh. But obviously nobody at Ohio State has complained about a single thing since they stole, if you want to call it that, this win from Michigan back in 2016. And Michigan fans are probably still crying, not just over that, but all of the other games they've lost to Ohio State in the last few years. So this one probably stings the most out of all of them because it came the closest. But an upset is still an upset. And this came down to one specific play, and that's what makes it probably my favorite play on this list. Next up is dating back to the 2009 Territorial Cup between Arizona and Arizona State. And during this game, this one becomes an upset because Arizona never even trailed Arizona State during the game. But somehow you could still feel it slipping away, and you could kind of feel Arizona State's performance overtaking Arizona's. Arizona was still up 14-0 at the half, and 17-10 with 2 minutes to play. And yet, here it was, jump forward about a minute later, it's tied at 17, and Arizona's punting back to the Sun Devils. So, here is Arizona State player Kyle Williams waiting back deep for the ball. And mind you, this is the same player that caught both of their touchdowns and returned a 53-yard punt to set up their field goal in the third quarter. So he is very trusted at this point, and all he has to do is catch the ball. But he muffs the punt unbelievably, and Arizona recovers it at the Arizona State 22-yard line as time expired. And the 32-yard game-winning field goal was kicked, sealing the game for Arizona and taking away Arizona State's chance at an upset. So this one sticks out to me a little more and is one of my favorites because it's kind of like a double upset. And just to make things a little more sour for Arizona State that season, they ended up losing 3 games that season on game-winning field goals. So that's definitely a sore spot for them still to this day, and there's no need to speculate on which one probably hurts the most, because it robbed them of a chance to upset their rivals, and that's why it makes the perfect upset play. That brings us to number 3, Miami versus Florida State in 2016, and they have a long, sad history behind this one of Florida State losing to Miami because of missed field goals specifically. It happened 5 times in 13 seasons between 1991 and 2003. So it may not sound like a lot, but that is probably highly unlikely for the same ending to happen against the same opponent that you share a state with and see all the time. So you could guess how annoying that has gotten for Florida State fans up until this 2016 meeting, and that serves as the backdrop for this game. So a Miami extra point attempt was blocked with just over a minute to play, and Florida State was trying to preserve their upset bid against Miami, who was ranked number 10 at the time. They were up by 1 point, and they had lost earlier that season, Florida State, to Louisville and the Lamar Jackson that we all know and love today. And they were really, really banking on knocking off the undefeated at the time Hurricanes and extending their series winning streak to 7. Couldn't probably have felt any better for them at the time. So just the pain and the desperation that went into securing this 1 point upset over Miami is what puts this one high up on the list for me. And it also was just a little bit nostalgic, and I wanted to give an extra boost to both of these teams because that game is actually the last time both of those teams faced each other as top 25 opponents. And this was once such a great rivalry, and most of it happened before the current field of college athletes was even born. So to see this return to the glory that it once had and actually see these two teams put up a good fight on national television would be a real treat. So here's hoping that happens. Number 4 on the list is 2002's Apple Cup, and that's played between Washington and Washington State. And back in 2002, Washington wasn't as great as a team as they've been in the last few years. They were mediocre, coming in at 5-5. But this game carried on to 3 overtimes against a number 3 ranked Washington State team. And it all came down to a play that still bugs Cougar fans to this day. And that play came on the first play of the bottom half of the 3rd overtime. And a Washington defender was able to bat down the screen pass coming from Washington State quarterback Matt Kegel, and then he fell on the ball, the Washington defender. So the Cougars and their home crowd, the Washington State home crowd, are thinking second down in their favor. The Washington Huskies on the other side are running onto the field in celebration, thinking that the screen is going to be ruled a backward pass and a live ball. So obviously now the officials need to huddle, and the ref announced that this game goes in favor of the Huskies. Game over. That's it. Ruled. Done in the history books. So if that's not the definition of an upset game, then I don't know what would be. But even though Washington State ended up going to the Rose Bowl, it still didn't cure the pain caused by losing to your top rival, in-state rival, on a game-ending judgment call. No matter who you are as a fan, what team you cheer for, that really is going to bug you deep down to your core. The fact that that's what it really came down to. And that's what makes this such a top upset play for me. But none of these top the number 1 play, and it really is an easy one to pick. It might be a little bit of a cop-out, but nothing in this generation will probably replace the memory of being able to watch this play unfold live, and that is, of course, the 2013 Iron Bowl. Of course. Classic. It doesn't even really need to be explained, but it came on the last play of this Auburn-Alabama game, and it will live for as long as these two teams clash and as long as it's college football. And it isn't just the play itself, but how the play came about. It adds so much more insult to this injury that Nick Saban had to fight for an appeal for the final 1 second to be put back on the clock. And we're all thinking that this game is going to overtime, of course. But nothing happens until that clock hits triple zeros. And be careful what you wish for, Nick Saban, because we all know what ended up unfolding in that 1 second. Chris Davis, 109-yard return off of a 57-yard missed field goal attempt, now goes down in history as the kick 6. And even the final margin of the game tells you exactly what happened. 34-28 is a 6-point gap and lets you know that it was a walk-off touchdown that sealed the deal on this upset play. Thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.